She had been locked away, declared mad, her spirit ground down until even breathing felt like an act of defiance, and the walls of her tower had become a silent jury that never stopped judging her. Then, on a day that should have been like any other, the most feared duke in London arrived at Ravenshaw, surveyed the remnants of her life with a gaze like winter steel, and with a single startling command, "She will be my duchess," he shattered the careful prison built around her and set in motion a chain of events that would alter not only her fate, but his own carefully frozen heart. Hello, lovely soul. If this sweeping, historical, romantic tale is tugging at your heart, I would be truly grateful if you'd show it a bit of love with a like or a subscribe, because that small kindness helps me bring you even more stories of longing, courage, and love stitched into the fabric of history. And if you feel comfortable sharing, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, since your messages genuinely brighten my day every time I read them. Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw stood in the dim drawing room as if she were the last inhabitant of a forgotten kingdom, the faded curtains drawn tight against the world beyond the windows, so that the October light could only seep in around the edges, struggling past heavy velvet to cast weak, elongated shadows over furniture that had long since disappeared beneath dust sheets. The Ravenshaw estate, which had once echoed with music and laughter, now felt less like a noble house, and more like a mausoleum, a prison whose walls seemed to close in a little more each day, until even the echo of her own footsteps sounded like an intrusion. She trailed one fingertip along the windowsill, leaving a narrow, clean path through the grime, and that single bright line only emphasized how thoroughly neglect had settled over everything. Even the servants, those last keepers of appearances, had abandoned the pretense that this place was a home and not a grave for all that had been. As always, she had awakened in her tower room, with its unchanging gray walls and narrow, joyless bed covered in a thin, inadequate coverlet, the same bleak view of the once beautiful gardens below where nothing bloomed now except weeds. Her reflection in the small, warped mirror above the washbasin had offered her no mercy. What looked back at her was a wraith more than a woman, too thin, collarbones sharp beneath sickly pale skin, dark smudges carved beneath green eyes that had once sparkled with mischief and curiosity, but now appeared dulled by laudanum and despair. Her dark hair hung in a limp, lifeless rope down her back, and though she was only 24, sorrow and sedation had etched an almost ancient weariness into her features. After dressing in yet another plain gray morning gown, Lady Agatha's unyielding decree, as if perpetual mourning were both costume and sentence, Seraphina had performed the small, secret ritual that tethered her to who she had been. Unlocking the concealed drawer in her writing desk, she drew out Isabella's letters, the precious stack of worn pages written in her younger sister's looping, cheerful script. She touched them as reverently as if they were relics from a saint. "Dearest Sarah, today we saw the most magnificent butterflies in the garden. Sarah, you must come quickly. I have discovered a nest of robins. My darling sister, I do not know what I would do without you." The words blurred as her throat tightened. 2 years had passed since she had heard Isabella's laughter, felt those impetuous arms thrown around her neck, seen that smile that had lit every room. A soft knock at the door broke the fragile stillness, and Mary, the youngest housemaid, entered with a breakfast tray and the small, brown bottle that had become as much a part of Seraphina's mornings as breathing. "Your medicine, my lady," Mary murmured, eyes firmly lowered, as if meeting Seraphina's gaze might somehow contaminate her. None of the servants looked at her directly anymore. The label "mad" had hung between them like a veil. "Thank you, Mary. You may leave it," Seraphina replied, her voice quiet but steadier than it had been weeks ago. Once the girl had gone, she rose, took the bottle, and crossed to the potted fern in the corner, an ailing little plant that, against all odds, still clung to life, and which had become her only companion in those rooms. She uncorked the bottle and poured the laudanum into the soil, watching the dark liquid soak into the earth. For 3 weeks now she had been secretly refusing the drug, allowing the fog to thin, and as clarity returned, thoughts became sharper, though they sometimes cut. Ironically, the fern seemed to thrive on what had once kept her half alive, a detail that almost made her smile. Returning to her desk, she found that her hands no longer shook quite so violently, and her mind, while achingly raw, felt less tangled, less muffled. Yet with that returning clarity came questions that gnawed relentlessly at her peace. Perhaps she truly was mad, she told herself as she stared at the unadorned gray walls. Perhaps seeing prison bars where others saw protection was in itself proof that Agatha and the physician had been right. But another voice, one that had been faint and nearly extinguished for so long, whispered from some deep, stubborn place within her. Or perhaps they have taught you to believe a carefully constructed lie. The thought was dangerous, so incendiary that it made her press her palm against her chest as though to steady the frantic beat of her heart. Inevitably, memory rose, unbidden and merciless. 2 years earlier, Isabella's bedchamber had been filled with the suffocating scent of sickness and desperate prayers. Serafina, then 22, had refused to leave her sister's side as the fever raged, bathing Isabella's burning brow, clasping her trembling hand, bargaining with a silent heaven that seemed deaf to her pleas. The solemn physician had eventually pronounced the verdict in a tone of professional defeat. There was nothing more to be done. Serafina had begged, wild, incoherent, demanding another remedy, another attempt, anything. But Isabella's eyes had opened, fever bright, and with a clarity that sliced straight through Serafina's terror. "Promise me you will not let grief consume you, Sarah," she had whispered, voice thread thin. "Promise me you will find happiness again." Serafina, choking on tears, had sworn it, clinging to her sister's hand as if sheer will might keep her tethered to the world. Isabella had smiled one last soft, luminous smile. Then her hand had gone slack, and the world had broken. The sound that tore from Serafina's throat had not been human. It had been the raw howl of an animal whose heart had been ripped from its chest. She had clung to Isabella's still body, refusing to let go, insisting that it was a mistake, that Isabella would wake, that God would not be so cruel, until 3 servants had pried her away. The days that followed dissolved into a blur of weeping that would not stop, of refusing food, of sleeping on the floor beside Isabella's empty bed, of rejecting all entreaties to behave with the decorum expected of a lady. Having already lost her mother 6 years earlier, losing Isabella felt like the final cutting of every tether to love, to family, to anything that made life bearable. Lady Agatha, her father's second wife, brought into the family with indecent haste less than a year after the first Lady Ravenshaw's death, had watched Serafina's grief not with compassion but with a cold, calculating disapproval. "This display is unseemly," she had declared, her voice like sharpened glass, hysterical, dangerous. What little warmth had ever existed between them had evaporated entirely, replaced by open hostility. A physician of Agatha's choosing, a man whose loyalty owed more to her purse than to his oath, had examined Serafina with perfunctory detachment. His diagnosis, melancholia of the severest nature with risk to herself and others, had been delivered as if her anguish were an inconvenience to be managed rather than a wound to be tended. His recommendation of immediate intervention had sealed Serafina's fate. The exile began quietly. At first she was confined more strictly to her rooms in the London townhouse, under the guise of rest. When her grief refused to evaporate on command, she was removed to Ravenshaw, far from society's gaze. Lady Agatha spun the tale with chilling skill. For her own safety and that of others, poor Lady Serafina, driven mad by sorrow, had been secluded. The gossip in London had taken fire at once. There were whispers of violent outbursts, shattered mirrors, servants fleeing from her screams. A tragic young woman who had lost her mind and now lurked like a dangerous ghost behind locked doors. The truth, crueler in its simplicity, was that her violence had been tears, her madness, a stubborn refusal to pretend that death had not broken her world. The laudanum had come under the benevolent label of medicine. "To calm your nerves, my dear, to ease your pain," Agatha had assured her, pressing the doctor's instructions with unrelenting insistence. A few drops became more, morning doses multiplied, and soon the drug blurred the edges of reality until the days smeared into each other, half dream and half nightmare. 2 years disappeared in that fog. Fragments of who she had been slipped from her grasp. Her father, Lord Ravenshaw, visited sporadically, his guilt visible in every averted glance and every hurried departure, yet he never challenged his wife, never questioned the physician, never defended his daughter. "I have become a ghost, haunting my own life," Seraphina thought now, as she stood at her tower window. Yet as the laudanum's grip loosened, something else stirred. Memories of laughter, of arguments over books, of gardens in spring, of her mother's soft voice. Anger began to rise within her, not the flailing, helpless anger of grief, but a slow, searing fury at what had been done to her under the guise of care. With that anger came a flicker of strength, unfamiliar after so much enforced weakness. That evening, as the heavy hush of Ravenshaw settled over the estate, Seraphina sat in her room with Isabella's last letter unfolded on the desk before her, tracing the ink with her fingertip, when Mary appeared again, hovering at the door as though reluctant to cross the threshold. "Begging your pardon, my lady," the girl said, her nerves evident in the way she clutched her apron. "But I was told to inform you. Visitors arriving tomorrow, the Duke of Ashford and his party. Something to do with a boundary dispute." Seraphina's fingers tightened around the letter. Her heart slammed against her ribs with sudden, inexplicable urgency. The name was not unfamiliar. Before her exile, she had heard it whispered in London drawing rooms. The Duke of Ashford, cold, unyielding, a man who had loved once and then withdrawn from the world after his wife's tragic death, building his reputation on ruthlessness and reserve. Society spoke of him in the hushed tone reserved for beautiful, dangerous weather, formidable, distant, potentially lethal. "Thank you, Mary," Seraphina managed, though the words scraped her throat, and when the girl withdrew, she remained seated, mind racing. She had not seen anyone from the wider world in 2 long years. What would they see when they looked at her now? Almost against her will, she approached the mirror, an object she had avoided whenever possible. The woman who faced her bore little resemblance to the vibrant girl she remembered. Gaunt cheeks, hollowed by sorrow and neglect, pale skin that seemed almost translucent, eyes too large in her thin face, shadowed by sleepless nights, and sedatives. Her hair, once thick and glossy, had been dragged back in a severe braid, as if to erase any trace of softness. Yet, as she studied herself more closely, forcing herself not to flinch, not to look away, she noticed something unexpected beneath the exhaustion and grief, a glimmer that refused to be entirely smothered, a spark. "They will see a madwoman," she whispered to the mirror, breathing mist onto the glass. "They will see what Agatha has told them to see." Her hand rose to the locket at her throat, the one piece of Isabella she had been allowed to keep, its familiar weight steadying her. "But perhaps," she murmured, her voice gaining strength, "perhaps I am more than their labels." It was a small thought, fragile and perilous, but it was real, and it was hers. For the first time in 2 years, Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw allowed herself to contemplate the possibility that she was not the broken, deranged creature they had named her. Perhaps she was simply a woman who had been drowning in grief while the world politely looked away, waiting for her to sink quietly. Perhaps she had been fighting all this time, even in her numbness, for a chance to breathe again. And perhaps, though the notion frightened her as much as it stirred her, the arrival of the Duke of Ashford might bring not more chains, but an unexpected witness, someone who might look past the convenient fiction of her madness and see the truth. The thought was terrifying. It was also a seed of something she had nearly forgotten how to feel. Beneath the fear and the lingering haze of the drug, beneath the grief and rage and disappointment, hope stirred, dangerous, delicate, but undeniably alive. Tomorrow the Duke would come, and the world might remain exactly as it was, leaving her to wither in her tower until she truly did lose her mind. Or everything might change in ways she could not yet imagine. That night, for the first time in years, Seraphina lay down without swallowing laudanum's false peace, and she did not dream of death. She dreamed, tentatively, of possibility. Edward Hawke, Duke of Ashford, had crafted his public persona from ice and stone until London believed quite correctly that he preferred it that way, At 32, he was known as the man who had loved once, buried his heart with his wife's body, and forged his grief into an impenetrable armor that no plea, no flirtation, no sympathy could pierce. He stood now in his study at Ashford House, surrounded by orderly shelves and neat stacks of documents, reviewing papers regarding an impending boundary dispute with the Ravenshaw estate, and felt the steady, anesthetized nothingness that had become his default state. Feeling nothing was a skill he had cultivated with relentless discipline, though it had not always been so. 4 years earlier, the world had been smaller, contained within the 4 walls of a birthing chamber that smelled of blood, fear, and fading hope. Edward had held Catherine's hand as the color drained from her face, watching helplessly while the physician tried, and failed, to stem the hemorrhage that was stealing her life. "I cannot stop it, Your Grace," the doctor had said, the words echoing with hollow futility. "I am sorry, I cannot stop it." Catherine, pale as moonlight yet somehow still gentle even in agony, had turned her head to find Edward's eyes. "Do not let this destroy you, Edward," she had whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Promise me you will live." He had sworn it, fingers gripping her hand so tightly he might have bruised the delicate bones, feeling her pulse flutter and weaken beneath his thumb like a trapped bird beating its wings against a closing cage. He had lied. The moment the words left his mouth, he had known that whatever version of himself had existed before was dying with her. Their child, the long-awaited heir, had survived for only 2 hours, and Edward had cradled the tiny, fragile body as its small chest rose and fell for the final time, feeling his hopes, his lineage, his imagined future vanish with that last breath. The funeral had been a spectacle, a double burial that drew the whole of London's attention. Edward, rigid and dry-eyed, had watched both coffins, one adult, one heartbreakingly small, lowered into the earth without outward reaction, and society had drawn its conclusions with ruthless speed. Cold as marble, the whispers had gone. Unfeeling. Perhaps he never loved her at all. They gossiped about how he had returned to estate business the very next day, discussing crops and ledgers as though he had not just buried his wife and child. Their judgment might have wounded another man, but Edward had embraced their misreading, because contempt was easier to endure than pity. The truth was that he felt everything with such excruciating intensity that if he allowed even a single crack in his composure, he feared he would disintegrate and never manage to reassemble himself. So he built a fortress instead: duty, discipline, parliamentary work, relentless efficiency. He paired his life of anything that might invite feeling. No art, no music, no frivolous gatherings unless strictly necessary for political alliances. His sister, Margaret, had watched this transformation with mounting alarm. 6 months earlier, she had cornered him in this very study, hands planted on her hips with characteristic determination. "You are not living, Edward," she had said. "You are existing, merely moving through the days like a man made of stone." He had replied without looking up from his accounts. "Existence is safer." "Safer than what?" she had demanded. "Safer than feeling? Safer than being human?" Only then had he lifted his gaze, and whatever she had seen in his expression had made her falter. "Yes," he had answered simply. "Safer than that." Now, 4 years on, he was the living embodiment of that decision. The cold Duke, moving through ballrooms and committee chambers like winter incarnate, beautiful in a severe way, unapproachable, and, according to some, quietly dangerous. People respected him, feared him, and speculated about him, but no one truly knew him, and he had considered that an acceptable price for control. The boundary dispute with Ravenshaw should have been a simple matter, rooted in deeds and surveyors' reports. Trees had been felled on contested land. Legal clarity was required. It was the sort of thing that should have engaged only his intellect, demanded 2 or 3 days at the estate and little more. He had planned to travel, settle the matter directly with Lord Ravenshaw, and return to London without incident. That plan had begun to unravel the moment Margaret announced her intention to accompany him. He had been at his desk, finalizing instructions, when she swept into the study already dressed for travel, bonnet in hand. "I am coming with you," she declared, ignoring both decorum and his butler's attempt to announce her. Edward did not look up immediately. "This is estate business, Margaret," he said. "Boundary lines, forestry rights, monstrously tedious. There is no need for you to endure it." "Then I shall bring books," she replied without missing a beat, "and my own excellent company. But I am coming." When he had tried to object, she had softened just enough to reveal the concern beneath her stubbornness. "You have not left London except for parliamentary duties in 2 years, Edward. You barely leave this house. I will not allow you to vanish into some remote estate alone." Recognizing that arguing with Margaret, once she had set her mind to something, was an exercise in futility, he had relented. Now, as their carriage rattled through the autumn countryside, he focused on the documents in his hand while she watched the turning leaves outside the window. He had nearly forgotten about her presence when she spoke. "The Ravenshaw family is quite tragic, from what I hear," she said, her tone light but edged with interest. Edward, eyes still on the papers, replied, "Most families are tragic in one way or another. Lord Ravenshaw is apparently weak," Margaret went on, undeterred, "utterly dominated by his second wife, Lady Agatha. Lady Peyton calls her quite the tyrant." Edward suppressed a sigh. "I am not interested in gossip." Margaret ignored this. "They say the eldest daughter went mad after her younger sister's death. A dreadful business by all accounts. She was considered very promising once, before." Something shifted inside him, a small tightening in his chest that he refused to name. "What happened to her?" he asked, striving for indifference, though he had the uncomfortable sense that Margaret heard the underlying note of curiosity. She cast him a knowing glance. "No one is entirely sure," she answered. "There are rumors of violent outbursts, complete loss of reason, and that she was locked away for her own safety." The words blurred on the page before him as his mind, unbidden, supplied memories of his own grief, the days when breathing had felt like betrayal, when he had moved through his duties in a haze, functioning solely because stopping would have meant collapsing. If he had been a woman, subject to the authority of a husband or father, would his numbness and sorrow have been called madness? Would someone have labeled him dangerous, then confined him, drugged him, and declared his grief inconvenient? The thought unsettled him enough that he cut it off sharply. The Ravenshaws' misfortunes were not his concern. He had enough of his own ghosts to wrestle without borrowing theirs. Still, the stone lodged beneath his ribs did not entirely dissolve. As the carriage turned up the long, weed-choked drive and Ravenshaw came into view, the estate's decline announced itself even before they reached the front steps. The house was grand in structure, with the bones of former splendor, yet neglect had crept into every corner. Overgrown gardens strangled by weeds, flower beds gone wild, paint peeling from window frames, and an air of exhaustion hanging about the place, as if the house itself had grown tired of pretending to be alive. Lady Agatha greeted them in the entrance hall with a display of almost theatrical warmth. "Your Grace, what an honor! And Lady Margaret, how delightful!" she trilled, her smile broad yet oddly hollow, never truly touching her eyes. She was a handsome woman in a severe way, her hair smoothed back without a single rebellious strand, her spine straight with brittle pride. Edward's instincts sharpened at once. This was a woman who clung to control with both hands and wore charm like a well-fitted mask. Lord Ravenshaw hovered behind her, shoulders bowed, his gaze drifting as if he wished himself anywhere else. He looked like a man who had ceded his will long ago and now floated on the surface of his own life. Tea in the parlor proved to be a strained affair. Lady Agatha steered the conversation with relentless energy, discussing boundary lines and property law with a fervor that struck Edward as excessive for such dry topics. Lord Ravenshaw contributed little beyond the occasional murmur, his eyes fixed more often on the view than on his guest. Edward found his attention wandering despite himself. He had the odd sense of waiting for something unnamed. His awareness sharpened when he saw a flicker of movement at the doorway, a figure passing, half-shadowed in the dim corridor. A woman moved past, pale and almost insubstantial, as if she had learned to inhabit space without drawing notice. For a brief moment their eyes did not meet, yet something about her presence caught and held him. She wore a washed-out gray that drained what little color remained in her face, yet her beauty was undeniable beneath the neglect. dark hair pulled back too tightly from a delicately structured face, high cheekbones, a full, soft mouth, and eyes, when he finally glimpsed them, of the most arresting green, clear and vivid like sunlight filtering through young leaves in spring, eyes that did not belong in a house that had given up on blooming. For one suspended, breathless moment, their gazes caught and held, and in those extraordinary green eyes Edward glimpsed far more than the convenient label Lady Agatha had offered him. He saw intelligence honed sharp as cut glass, a depth of pain so raw it made his own chest ache, a desolate loneliness that echoed his own, and beneath all of it a fierce, stubborn spark that refused to die no matter how thoroughly someone had tried to smother it. Lady Agatha's voice cut across the air like a knife through silk, shattering the fragile connection. "Pay her no mind, your grace. My stepdaughter is unwell, quite mad, I am afraid. A tragedy, of course, but we do what we can to keep her comfortable." Edward saw the way Seraphina's hands trembled at those words, the slight quiver of her fingers against the folds of her gown. Yet he also saw the almost imperceptible lift of her chin, a gesture of delicate, fragile pride that struck him with unexpected force, as if someone had driven a fist directly into his ribs. She moved away down the corridor with the silent, practiced grace of a ghost who has long since learned to pass unnoticed, and only when she vanished from sight did Edward realize he had been holding his breath. "Mad," Lady Agatha repeated, with that chilly finality people use when they wish to close a subject forever. She was never quite right, even before her sister's death, but afterward, well, it is a mercy we can keep her here, away from society's cruel judgments. Edward inclined his head, lifted his teacup, and forced himself to resume talk of boundary stones and survey reports. Yet the conversation washed over him without finding purchase, because what he had seen in those green eyes refused to be dismissed as easily as Agatha's comfortable story. He had stood close to the edge of madness himself in the black aftermath of Catherine's death, had known what it was to forget how to sleep or eat or draw breath in a world that seemed emptied of meaning, and what he had just witnessed in Seraphina Ravenshaw's gaze was not madness. It was a soul drowning, still thrashing toward the light. That night, sleep evaded him entirely. He stood at the window of the guest chamber, looking out across the sprawling grounds of Ravenshaw, with the gardens below transformed by moonlight into a pale, neglected wilderness. Overgrown hedges loomed like dark sentinels, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath, the great stone facade heavy with years of silence and secrets. As he watched, a single point of light flared to life in a distant tower window, one lonely candle flame burning against the immense darkness. A slim silhouette moved across the glass. Even at this distance, he knew it was her, the woman with the green eyes. Lady Agatha had spoken her name only once, as if reluctant to give even that much. Seraphina. There she was, pacing her tower chamber while the rest of the household slept, awake and alone in that high, confined space. Edward watched longer than he had any right to, more than was wise or necessary. He thought of the narrow choices that had been available to him after Catherine's death, how he had chosen to build a fortress of ice around his grief, to harden rather than shatter, and how those choices, however ruinous, had still been his to make because he was a man, a duke, a person with power. Then he considered what choices Seraphina could possibly have been offered. He remembered Lady Agatha's glib dismissal, Lord Ravenshaw's guilty, sliding gaze, the way the servants seemed to tighten with unspoken tension whenever the subject of the mad daughter came near. He remembered her face, the quick, bright intelligence in her eyes, the dignity in the way she held herself even as she trembled. Mad, Agatha had called her, with the calm certainty of someone who had never stood on that precipice herself. Edward knew too well the distinction between a mind unhinged and a heart broken, between true derangement and grief that refused to be politely contained. What he saw in that tower was not a lunatic. It was a woman left to drown while those around her stood at the shore and called it kindness. Abruptly, he turned away from the window, angry with himself for caring, angry for allowing the first hairline crack to appear in walls that had taken him 4 long years to construct. He undressed, lay down, and tried to summon that old, familiar blankness that had served him so well Yet his mind refused to empty. Instead, a single idea circled and settled like a stone in his chest. What if no one had ever bothered to throw her a rope? What if she had been struggling for breath for 2 years while everyone else watched, nodded solemnly, and called it treatment and mercy? He shut his eyes, but sleep never came. And in the tower chamber, Seraphina's candle burned stubbornly until dawn. Seraphina Ravenshaw had survived the past 2 years by refining the art of invisibility until it was as instinctive as breathing, believing that if she stayed quiet enough, small enough, acquiescent enough, she might avoid the worst of Lady Agatha's displeasure. Yet the Duke's eyes had rested on her, had seen her, not merely as a hazy figure at the edge of vision, but as a person, and that unexpected recognition unsettled her as much as it warmed her. She woke the morning after his arrival with a clarity that still startled her. There was no drugged heaviness dragging her thoughts into molasses, no wool pressing against her mind. For 3 weeks now she had fed the laudanum to the fern in the corner rather than to her own veins, a small rebellion that had steadily thinned the fog. The world, in consequence, seemed harshly bright and sharply outlined, every sound louder, every color more insistent. Pale morning light slipped around the edge of the curtains in her tower room, and she lay on her narrow bed staring at the cracked plaster ceiling, replaying in unforgiving detail that instant in the corridor when the Duke's gaze had met hers. She had braced herself for disgust or curiosity, or that cold, distant pity people reserve for the unfortunate. Yet what she had seen there had been something else altogether. Concern, certainly, but also a sort of startled recognition, as if he had glimpsed in her something that mirrored a part of himself. Why should he look at her that way? The mad Ravenshaw daughter was a convenient story, passed from drawing room to drawing room until it had hardened into fact. Men like the Duke of Ashford did not question such stories. They accepted them and moved on. So why had he not looked away? A sharp knock at the door interrupted the loop of memory. It was not Mary who entered, but Lady Agatha's personal maid, a thin woman with a pinched face that seemed permanently arranged into disapproval. "Lady Ravenshaw sends a message, my lady," she announced, each word steeped in disdain. "You are to remain in your chambers until the Duke departs. You are not to show yourself or create further embarrassment for the family." For 2 years, Seraphina's response to such edicts had been automatic. Nod, lower her eyes, accept the verdict, and retreat even further into herself. The habits of obedience, once ingrained, were hard to break. Yet something had shifted within her recently. The laudanum's chains were loosening, and with her sharpened thoughts had come a thin, insistent thread of anger. Yesterday the Duke had seen her in the corridor. Today she found she could not quite bear the thought of shrinking back into her tower and pretending she did not exist. "Tell Lady Ravenshaw," Seraphina said, and even to her own ears her voice sounded steadier than she expected, "that I will take my breakfast in the conservatory this morning." The maid stared as though Seraphina had suddenly begun speaking Greek. "My lady," she faltered. Her ladyship was quite clear. "I know what she said," Seraphina replied, sitting up and meeting the other woman's eyes with a composure that surprised them both. "Kindly inform her that I will be in the conservatory." The maid hesitated, clearly torn between the command of the stepdaughter and the anticipated fury of the mistress of the house, then finally bobbed a jerky curtsy and hurried out, presumably to deliver the message and preserve herself. The moment the door closed, the tremors began. Seraphina's hands shook violently, and she pressed them together to keep from shattering entirely. It was, in the grand scheme of things, a trivial defiance, choosing where to eat breakfast, yet it felt as though she had just dragged a sword across the first bar of her cage. She rose, her legs unsteady but determined, and opened her wardrobe herself instead of waiting for a maid. Her hand passed over the endless row of gray gowns before closing on a garment she had not dared to wear in 2 years, a simple morning dress of soft, faded blue. When she held it up, she saw at once that it hung looser than she remembered. Exile and dosage had carved away the flesh from her bones. Still, it was not gray. That alone felt like a revolution. She buttoned it with clumsy fingers, then stood before the mirror and studied the woman reflected back, thinner, paler, with shadows carved beneath her eyes, yet undeniably wearing color again. "I do not entirely recognize you," she whispered to her reflection, fingers brushing the modest neckline. But perhaps it is time to make your acquaintance. The conservatory, when she stepped inside, felt like entering another world. Once it had been her mother's pride, a glass cathedral filled with carefully tended exotic plants, fragrant citrus, and cascades of flowers. Now neglect had turned it into a kind of elegant wilderness. Vines coiled up the metal framework, ferns spilled over cracked tiles, and potted trees strained toward the light filtering through smudged panes of glass. It was unruly and half-forgotten, yet fiercely alive in a way the rest of the house was not. Serafina moved among the foliage with reverent hands, letting her fingers trail over glossy leaves and rough bark. She paused beneath the orange tree that had grown far beyond its intended size, inhaled the faint, lingering scent, and lifted her face toward the wan warmth of the sun. It struck her then just how long it had been since she had stood in sunlight rather than merely seen it from behind glass. She had brought a book, Wordsworth, its cover soft with use, and settled near a patch of light, more for the comfort of the pages than any real intention to read. She had just reached a familiar line about daffodils when the sound of approaching footsteps made her whole body tense. For a heartbeat, she was certain it would be Lady Agatha, come to drag her back upstairs and remind her, with biting precision, of her place. Instead, when she looked up, she saw him. Edward Hawke stood in the conservatory doorway, his tall frame framed by climbing greenery, his eyes sweeping the room with a soldier's alertness before settling, finally, on her. For an instant she considered fleeing, then remembered the blue dress on her back and the fact that she had chosen to be here. Running now would be a betrayal of that choice. "I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude," he said, his voice lower and more careful than she had heard it in the parlor. "I came to admire the structure. It is remarkable." Serafina swallowed, her instinct to apologize for existing battling with the fragile resolve she had begun to build. "The conservatory was my mother's pride," she managed, her words catching only slightly. "Before—" She gestured to the wild growth around them, letting the unfinished sentence hold all that it needed to. "Before illness, before death, before this house became more tomb than home." He stepped further inside, moving with the unhurried caution one might use when approaching a wounded creature. Sunlight picked out threads of silver in his dark hair and cast faint shadows beneath his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them seemed to know how to bridge the distance between them, and silence stretched like thin glass. "Lady Margaret mentioned that you have been unwell," he said at last, his tone gentle rather than prying. "I hope you are recovering." A short, startled laugh escaped her before she could contain it, more bitter than amused. "Unwell," she repeated softly. "Is that the phrase being used now? How very considerate." Immediately she regretted the edge in her tone. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she added, pressing her fingers to her temple. "My conversation has been largely limited to servants and physicians these past years. I am out of practice. How long have you been kept here?" he asked, not stepping closer, yet clearly unwilling to retreat. "At Ravenshaw, I mean." 2 years, she answered, the words dropping heavily between them like stones. "Though there are days when it feels considerably longer." She hesitated, then continued, driven by some instinct that told her honesty with this man might not be entirely foolish. "Before that, I lived in London with my sister, Isabella." He did not miss the quiet past tense. "She died," he said, not as a question, but with the subdued certainty of someone who recognizes the shape of loss. Serafina nodded, her throat tightening. Her hand had already risen to the locket at her neck, the gesture so habitual she barely felt it. "My wife died 4 years ago in childbirth," Edward said, his gaze turning briefly distant. "Our son as well." Her eyes snapped to his face, and in that moment the rigid, commanding Duke fell away, leaving behind a man marked by grief every bit as profound as her own. The control remained, but beneath it she could see the lines carved by sleepless nights and unvoiced agony. "I am very sorry," she whispered, the inadequacy of the words burning, yet they were all she had to offer. "Society expected me to mourn with dignity," he continued, the faintest hint of dry irony threading through the pain. "Quietly, briefly, then return to my duties as if I had not just buried my entire future. There were appropriate timeframes for sorrow, appropriate ways to express it, and anything beyond that made people Uncomfortable. His mouth tightened. I wanted to tear the world apart. But you did not, Serafina said quietly. No, he agreed. Bitterness and self-knowledge twined together. I entombed it. I became precisely what they expected, a man of ice and iron. It seemed preferable to unraveling in public. He looked back at her. And you? I did the opposite, she said. I screamed. I wept until I could not see, refused food, refused to leave Isabella's room. I questioned God and everyone around me for allowing her to die. I could not pretend. I would not. The air between them thickened with understanding. And they called that madness, he said, his voice low. And this time it was not a question at all. She met his gaze with steady, aching honesty. Perhaps madness is merely grief expressed in ways society finds inconvenient, she replied. Something in his expression shifted. Surprise first, then recognition, and then a quiet, dawning respect. For the first time, Serafina allowed herself to wonder whether this cold, distant duke might perceive her in a way no one else had tried to in 2 long, drugged years. Before he could answer, a bright, familiar voice drifted into the conservatory. There you are, Edward. I have been hunting for you everywhere. Oh, Lady Margaret Hawke halted just inside the doorway, and her features lit with genuine pleasure when she saw Serafina. Lady Serafina, what a delight! This conservatory is enchanting, is it not? Indeed, Edward replied, and Serafina could have sworn she heard a thread of humor in his tone. Where her brother carried shadow around him like a cloak, Margaret was all sunlight and open warmth. She moved into the room at once, as if determined to knit the 3 of them together with sheer will. You must tell me about these plants, she said to Serafina. I always manage to kill anything I try to nurture, but I so admire those who do not share my talent for botanical murder. Serafina found herself, almost against her own expectation, relaxing under Margaret's guileless interest. This was my mother's domain, she said softly. She imported many of these specimens herself. That is a lemon tree from Italy, and over there, she touched a graceful vine bearing small purple blooms, a passion flower from the Americas. How extraordinary, Margaret breathed. And you are a reader as well. I see Wordsworth has found his way into your hands. He is one of my favorites. It had been so long since anyone had shown curiosity about her mind, rather than her supposed condition, that Serafina nearly forgot how to respond. I have always loved poetry, she admitted cautiously. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Blake? Oh, Blake. Margaret clasped her hands. The marriage of heaven and hell is outrageous and brilliant, though I am obliged to pretend I have never read it in certain company. Have you seen Songs of Innocence and of Experience? For 10 stolen minutes, the 3 of them spoke only of books, of poems and prose, of the way certain lines lingered in the mind like music. Margaret chattered with easy enthusiasm. Edward occasionally offered a dry but insightful observation, and Serafina, to her astonishment, discovered that words came more smoothly than she expected when she was not being treated as a patient or a problem. The tautness in her shoulders loosened. She forgot to be afraid, and Edward, for his part, seemed to forget to be entirely remote. It was the first conversation in 2 years that had not revolved around her symptoms, and it felt like drawing breath after being held underwater. The illusion shattered with the crack of a single word. Serafina! Lady Agatha stood at the threshold, her expression carved from marble and barely leashed rage simmering behind her eyes. Your rooms, she said, each syllable as sharp as a slap. Now! Serafina flinched, her body responding to the command before her mind could protest, but she saw at the same moment the way Edward straightened and Margaret's amiable expression hardened. Lady Ravenshaw, Edward said, rising with unhurried calm. We were merely discussing literature. I found your stepdaughter's observations quite illuminating. Agatha's smile appeared, brittle and cold. Your Grace is good to indulge her, she replied. However, Serafina tires easily. It is best for her to rest. She crossed the space with brisk, clipped steps and closed a claw-like hand around Serafina's arm, her fingers digging hard enough to bruise through the blue fabric. Come along, child. Every part of Serafina wanted to pull back, to say no, to declare that she was not a child, that she wished to stay among sunlight and voices instead of returning to her narrow room. Yet 2 years of training and sedative obedience clamped down, and she rose without a word. As Agatha guided her away, she dared one last look over her shoulder. The shame of being hauled away like a misbehaving child burned in her cheeks, yet mingled with it was a desperate, silent plea. Do not let her story be the only one you believe. Remember what you have seen. The moment she left, Lady Agatha turned back, already arranging her face into an expression of wounded concern. I must apologize for my stepdaughter's imposition, Your Grace, Lady Margaret. She has these flashes of lucidity that can be quite deceptive. One might almost imagine her entirely sound, but unfortunately it never lasts. She appeared perfectly rational to me, Margaret replied, her voice tight. But of course she did, my dear, Agatha soothed, dripping condescension. Seraphina is an accomplished actress when she wishes to be. You did not see her after Isabella's death. The outbursts, the destruction. Truly, it was distressing for everyone. Edward's skepticism sharpened. What precisely occurred? He asked, his tone bland yet edged with steel. Agatha sighed as if burdened by memories too tragic to bear. She spoke of servants attacked, of objects smashed, of a young woman who screamed that she wished she had died instead of her sister, of threats to harm herself. Each accusation contained just enough truth, a hint of real words spoken in the depths of grief, to make the heavy embroidery of invention more difficult to separate from reality. We consulted 3 different physicians, she concluded solemnly. All agreed on melancholia of the severest degree, with possible hereditary madness from her mother's line. They recommended strict control and isolation. We keep her here for her security and frankly for society's. Can you imagine if she were unleashed upon London in such a state? Margaret opened her mouth, plainly ready to contest this narrative, but Edward caught her eye with a small shake of his head. There was nothing to be gained by confronting Agatha without evidence. Once the lady had sailed away, satisfied she had reasserted control over the story, Margaret rounded on her brother. That woman is lying, she said flatly. I would wager my life on it. As would I, Edward answered, no longer bothering to conceal his grim conviction. He thought of Seraphina's articulate reflections in the conservatory, the clarity of her mind, the insight in her eyes. That was not a disordered intellect, but a person who had been silenced. He remembered the flinch when Agatha seized her arm, the automatic, almost practiced submission. This was not care. It was confinement. That evening, he surprised his secretary by announcing that their stay at Ravensshore would be extended. Send word to London, Edward instructed. Clear my schedule for the next fortnight. The estate business here is more complicated than we anticipated. The parliamentary session begins next week, Your Grace, the man protested gently. Lord Peyton is counting on your presence for the reform debates. Lord Peyton will have to count on me another time, Edward replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. See to it. Later, when the secretary had gone, Margaret appeared in the doorway of his temporary study, one eyebrow arched. You are staying because of her, she said, without bothering to cloak it as a question. Edward did not deny it. He poured himself a measure of brandy and stared at it for a long moment before answering. Something is profoundly wrong in this house, Margaret. Yes, she agreed quietly, coming to sit opposite him. A tyrant for a stepmother, a father made of regret and cowardice, and a young woman drugged into silence because her grief is inconvenient. I would say that qualifies. He thought again of Seraphina's soft, fierce observation. Perhaps madness is simply grief society finds inconvenient, and of the way she had looked at him as though she could not quite believe someone might listen. I cannot leave her here, he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them aloud. Not yet, not until I know exactly what has been done and what can be undone. Margaret's eyes softened. That, she said, is perhaps the most human thing I have heard you say in 4 years. He did not smile, but something long dormant inside him stirred painfully, cracking the ice around his heart, feeling hurt. Yet as he lay awake that night, quietly aching, he realized the pain also meant that part of him was not as dead as he had believed. In a tower not far away, Seraphina fell asleep thinking not of laudanum and escape, but of dark eyes that held understanding, of sunlight in a glass house, and of the astonishing notion that she might matter to someone beyond the confines of her own grief. In the slow weeks that followed, the atmosphere at Ravensshore altered almost imperceptibly, like the gradual lengthening of days after midwinter. Two people who had long forgotten how to live began, step by hesitant step, to remember. The transformation did not come through grand declarations, but through a series of small decisions, repeated glances, and quiet acts of courage. Edward, whose instinct in all things was to proceed with method and precision, began with what he knew: observation and evidence. However strong his suspicions regarding Lady Agatha's treatment of Seraphina, he could not afford to act on outrage alone. He needed facts, witnesses, and documents that would withstand scrutiny beyond the walls of Ravensshore. In the first week, he took to rising early, walking the estate at dawn, and studying the rhythm of the household. From a distance, he noted how Seraphina's meals were carried on trays to the tower 3 times a day, how she was permitted brief solitary walks in a walled corner of the garden under the watchful eye of a distant servant, how even those who served her avoided meeting her gaze as if under strict instructions not to engage. The avoidance did not have the texture of fear of her, it looked more like fear of being seen speaking to her. Edward struck up seemingly casual conversations with staff. The aging groundskeeper, who had worked at Ravensshore since Lord Ravenshaw's youth, mentioned in the tone of a man who missed better days that Lady Seraphina had once walked the rose paths every morning, pruning and tending with her own hands. "Loved the flowers, she did, Your Grace, especially the pale pink climbers by the east wall," he said. Then her ladyship, and everyone in the house knew which lady he meant, declared it unsafe, said the young mistress might do herself a mischief left to her own devices. "Never seemed right to me." A young maid, cornered briefly in the corridor when Lady Agatha was elsewhere, confirmed that Seraphina had for years been given medicine 3 times daily at her guardian's insistence. When Edward gently pressed for details, she paled and retreated, clearly terrified of being overheard, and he let her go rather than risk bringing punishment down upon her. The pattern, however, was clear enough for a man who had seen opiates used in sick rooms before. Seraphina was not merely confined, she was being chemically pacified. He needed someone with the courage to speak plainly. Mrs. Harding, the housekeeper, had served 3 generations of Ravenshaws and wore her loyalty like armor. He found her alone in the still room, hands busy over jars of preserves, and closed the door behind him with deliberate care. "Mrs. Harding," he said without preamble, "I require the truth, not the version Lady Ravenshaw prefers, but the real history. Is Lady Seraphina truly mad?" The old woman's hands froze. Tears sprang to her eyes so quickly it was as if he had pressed a bruise. "Mad?" she repeated hoarsely. "No, Your Grace. Heartbroken, yes, grieving, yes, but not mad. Never mad." The story spilled out of her in fits and starts, the dam of silence finally cracking. After Isabella's death, Seraphina had succumbed to a grief so deep it frightened those who prized decorum over feeling. She had wept without restraint, refused food, refused to leave her sister's room, and begged to be left with her sorrow. She had not, according to Mrs. Harding, struck anyone or destroyed property beyond incidentally upsetting a vase in one hysterical moment. Instead, she had been guilty of the unforgivable sin of refusing to pretend. Lady Agatha, seeking control and perhaps more, had summoned Dr. Thornbury, a physician in her debt. He had prescribed laudanum for Seraphina's nerves, initially in small doses that soon increased, until the young woman existed in a permanent haze, docile, compliant, easily managed. The tales of wild violence and dangerous insanity had grown in the telling, convenient justifications for a decision already made. "Why?" Edward asked, his voice like ice. "Why go to such lengths to subdue her own stepdaughter?" Mrs. Harding's expression hardened like stone. She explained about the inheritance left by Seraphina's mother, funds held in trust until Seraphina either married or reached the age of 30, with 6 years still left on that clock. If Seraphina were deemed incompetent, Lady Agatha, as her legal guardian, would control that fortune. The cold, steady fury that settled over Edward then was unlike the grief he had known. It was a clear, focused anger, at the deliberate cruelty of drugging and isolating a grieving young woman for money. "From this moment," he said quietly, "Lady Seraphina is to receive no more laudanum. If Lady Ravenshaw asks, you will assure her the doses are being administered and you will substitute something harmless. One way or another I will deal with the consequences. Can you do this?" Hope flooded the older woman's face, fragile yet fierce. "Gladly, Your Grace," she whispered. "I have prayed for such a chance." In the second week, Edward shifted from private discovery to strategic action. The boundary dispute that had brought him to Ravenshaw in the first place blossomed under his direction into a matter of surprising complexity, requiring additional surveyors, the arrival of his solicitor from London, and endless consultations over maps and deeds. So long as he wrapped his continued presence in the respectable cloak of estate business, Lady Agatha could not very well demand his departure without risking offense to a powerful duke. Simultaneously, he and Margaret began quietly, widening Seraphina's world. Morning walks in the garden were arranged ostensibly for Margaret's pleasure, with Seraphina invited along to guide them through the old plantings. Afternoon tea was taken in the conservatory, where the glass walls gave the illusion of freedom even if the estate gates remained closed. Margaret insisted Seraphina join them in the library, declaring that she needed another woman's opinion on a particularly scandalous novel. Agatha could hardly deny a duke and his sister the courtesy of a hostess's daughter, without exposing the thinness of her delicate invalid narrative. As the laudanum drained from her system entirely, the changes in Seraphina were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Her speech grew smoother, her conversation quicker, her laughter, shaky and rare but real, began to emerge like a bird from a long-closed cage. "It feels as though I am waking from a dream that was somehow also a nightmare," she confessed one afternoon in the library, fingers resting on a book she had no memory of reading. "Everything is louder, brighter. Sometimes it hurts. It will hurt less in time," Edward told her, with the quiet authority of someone who had once clawed his way through his own pain. Margaret added with her usual practicality, "And until it does, you will have us. No one should have to relearn the world alone." By the third week, color had returned to Seraphina's cheeks, and her natural wit, dry, a touch sardonic, never unkind, revealed itself. She made an observation about the absurd coincidences in a Gothic novel that made Margaret spill her tea with laughter, and Edward found himself smiling before he even realized he was doing it. They began to share pieces of themselves beyond grief. Seraphina spoke of Isabella's delight in birds, of how she could identify them all by song. Edward spoke of Catherine's quiet courage, of the guilt he had hauled like a weight ever since, simply for continuing to exist. "I told myself that isolation was safety," he admitted one gray afternoon as they walked along the remnants of the rose path. "That if I did not allow anyone close, nothing could be taken from me again." Seraphina paused beside a bare rose bush, her fingertip slipping carefully along a thorn. "And I told myself that I deserved isolation," she answered softly, "that my sorrow made me monstrous, and that I should be hidden. We were both wrong, it seems. Perhaps we are at least less wrong now," he replied, surprising himself. She smiled faintly, and for the first time, Hope did not feel entirely foolish. By the fourth week, the attraction between them was no longer something they could pretend not to feel. Edward found himself listening for her step in the corridor, watching for a flash of blue or lavender at the corner of his vision, inventing reasons to escort her from one room to another. He noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the little breath she took before answering a difficult question, the radiance of her full smile when something genuinely amused her. Seraphina, for her part, became acutely aware of him in ways that unsettled and warmed her at once. She was conscious of the breadth of his shoulders when they walked side by side, the rough gentleness of his voice when he addressed her as Lady Seraphina rather than child, the way his implacable expression softened when she spoke. One afternoon, reaching simultaneously for the same volume of Byron on a high shelf, their hands brushed. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet sparks raced up her arm, and from the sharpness of his inhale, she knew he felt it too. "Forgive me," he said, stepping back, though his voice had grown noticeably rougher. "There is nothing to forgive. she replied, cheeks warming. "Except perhaps that neither of us has learned to share books graciously." "Perhaps we might read it together then," he suggested, and the simple sentence carried a weight neither of them dared name. Margaret, whose instincts for matters of the heart were far keener than her brother's, saw all of this with increasing satisfaction. One evening she cornered Edward, arms crossed. "You are falling in love with her," she said in the tone of someone pointing out the weather. "I am ensuring she is not mistreated," he countered too quickly. "You smiled today," Margaret said with disarming gentleness. "You smiled 3 times, Edward, and all 3 times you were looking at her. I have not seen you do that since before Catherine died. If you cannot name what that means, I can do it for you." She laid a hand on his arm. "It is not a betrayal of Catherine to let your heart beat again. If anything, I think she would scold you for taking so long." In the 5th week, Lady Agatha, sensing her control slipping, attempted to reassert it by returning to old methods. She dispatched her maid to the tower with new instructions regarding Seraphina's medicine, but Mrs. Harding intercepted the bottle and brought it straight to Edward. Confronted later, Agatha smoothed the incident over with talk of relapses and medical advice, but Edward's bland civility barely veiled his warning. "I have developed a particular interest in Lady Seraphina's welfare," he told her, his tone perfectly polite, his eyes anything but. "I should be most displeased to learn that any treatment she receives is not in her best interest." The message was clear. He was watching, and so was his title. Thwarted in that avenue, Agatha shifted to a more insidious tactic, poisoning Seraphina's hope. She visited the tower under the guise of maternal concern, and spoke of the Duke with soft venom. "He is merely entertaining himself, my dear," she murmured one afternoon. "Men like him enjoy a little rescue fantasy. You are a distraction, a project. Once he returns to London and tires of playing the benevolent savior, you will come back here where you belong. You must not delude yourself into imagining more." For someone still rebuilding her sense of self, the words hit their mark. Seraphina tried to reason with herself, to trust the evidence of her own eyes, yet doubt seeped into the cracks. She grew quieter around Edward, more reserved. The light he had begun to coax forth dimmed as she braced herself for abandonment. He noticed at once. One afternoon, when her responses had grown particularly distant, he set aside the book they had been pretending to read and regarded her steadily. "Have I done something to offend you?" he asked. She stared at her hands, fingers twisting together. "Why are you here, truly?" she whispered. "The boundary dispute could have been settled days ago. Why spend your time with me?" Understanding sliced through him. He could almost hear Lady Agatha's poisonous suggestions in the spaces between Seraphina's words. He moved to the chair opposite hers, deliberately closing some of the physical distance while leaving enough space that she would not feel cornered. "I am here because, when I speak with you, the hollow place inside me fills," he said quietly. "Because you understand losses I cannot easily name. Because in your company I remember there is more to life than duty and survival. That is the simple truth." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "But I am," she faltered, searching for the word that had been used as a weapon against her. "Damaged." "Society uses that word when it wishes to discard someone who makes it uncomfortable," Edward replied, fierceness sharpening his tone. "You are not damaged, Seraphina. You have been wounded, and you have been punished for refusing to pretend the wound did not exist. That is not the same thing. Pain is not evidence of weakness. If anything, the way you still stand, still think, still feel, after what has been done to you, speaks of a strength I am not certain I possess." He reached out then, slowly enough for her to pull away if she chose, and brushed his thumb lightly along her cheek, catching a tear before it fell. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them as he leaned closer, his breath mingling with hers, the unspoken promise of a kiss, hanging fragile and electric in the air. Margaret's footsteps and cheerful call echoed down the corridor, shattering the moment like glass. They sprang apart, both flushed, both breathing too quickly. Yet something had been acknowledged that neither laudanum nor Lady Agatha's lies could erase. In the 6th week, winter announced itself in earnest. Snow fell in soft, steady curtains, draping Ravenshore in white and muffling sound. Edward requested a private audience with Lord Ravenshaw in the latter's study, a gloomy room lined with neglected ledgers and stale regrets. "Your Grace," the older man began nervously, "I hope we are close to resolving the boundary issue. Lady Ravenshaw is eager for—" "This is not about trees," Edward interrupted, his voice like a blade. "This is about your daughter." Lord Ravenshaw paled. "Seraphina? I have, in the course of my stay, become acquainted with certain facts regarding Lady Seraphina's condition and her inheritance," Edward said, each word measured. "I will only ask this once, and I expect the truth. Is she, in your honest judgment, insane? Or has she been drugged and confined for reasons that have nothing to do with her safety?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an age before the older man's shoulders sagged, as though the weight of years had finally crushed him. "She is not mad," he whispered. "She never was. She grieved for her sister, and I allowed my wife to convince me it was dangerous, that the inheritance might tempt her to recklessness. I told myself it was for her own good. In truth, I was afraid of my wife, afraid of scandal, afraid of everything except what I should have feared most, that I was abandoning my child." Tears spilled down his cheeks. "I am a coward, Your Grace." Edward did not bother to contradict him. "Then you will, at the very least, assist in setting right what you helped break," he said coolly. "I intend to ask for Lady Seraphina's hand in marriage. You will grant your consent, and you will ensure that Lady Ravenshaw does not interfere." Lord Ravenshaw stared at him in stunned disbelief. "You would marry her, knowing what people believe?" "People believe what they are told," Edward replied. "I no longer place much faith in their judgment. I place it in my own." The older man bowed his head. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "Yes, of course, it is more than I deserve. If she can find happiness after all this, I will not stand in the way." That night, alone in his chamber, Edward sat at the small writing desk with 2 sheets of paper before him and a candle guttering low. The first letter he composed was to his solicitor in London, instructing him to investigate fully the terms of Lady Seraphina's inheritance, the legal status of her guardianship, and any means by which her rights could be secured against further interference. The second was addressed to the Archbishop of Canterbury, requesting a special license for marriage, which would allow the ceremony to take place quickly and quietly at Ravenshaw rather than under the public gaze in London. He did not know whether Seraphina would accept him. He did not presume upon her gratitude or her emerging affection. But he knew with absolute clarity that he wished to ask, that in the span of 6 weeks she had awakened a part of him he believed buried forever in Catherine's grave, not a replacement, but a new, separate tenderness that grew in the space carved by shared pain and hard-won trust. As he sealed the letters, he felt both a flicker of fear and an unfamiliar, fragile excitement. For the first time in years, the future did not stretch before him as an endless gray corridor of duty and numbness. Instead, it held a single blazing possibility, as precarious and precious as a candle burning in a tower window against the dark: ability to hope, to care, to love. In the tower, Seraphina sat by her window, watching snow fall over the estate grounds. The world was quiet, peaceful in its blanket of white. She touched Isabella's locket at her throat, her fingers tracing the familiar metal. "I think I am falling in love, Bella," she whispered to the empty room, to the sister she would never stop missing. "Is that allowed? Am I permitted to feel this after losing you?" The silence offered no answer, but in her heart she knew what Isabella would say. She could almost hear her sister's voice, warm and full of life. "Yes, Sarah, live. Please, please live." And for the first time since Isabella's death, Seraphina believed she might actually be able to tomorrow. Everything might change. Edward could, in time, return to London alone and resume the carefully controlled existence that had earned him the title of the Cold Duke, leaving behind nothing more than an echo of kindness and a handful of memories in a forgotten tower. Yet there was another possibility that made Seraphina's heart race with a terrifying, fragile joy. The thought that perhaps he might stay, or that he might ask her to go with him, that this precarious interlude was not the end of something brief and miraculous, but the beginning of a life she had never dared imagine for herself. She pressed her palm to the chill of the window glass and, just for a moment, allowed herself to believe that beginnings were possible, even for those who had been told their story was over. While outside, the snow fell in a soft, relentless curtain, cloaking the dead gardens, the neglected paths, and the gray walls of her prison in a blanket of white that made everything appear clean and new, as though the world itself were offering her the smallest chance to start again. Edward Hawke had once faced the noise and chaos of battlefields, stood his ground against political adversaries in Parliament, and survived the annihilating grief of burying both his wife and child, yet none of those trials felt as daunting as the task before him now, which was simply to ask a woman who had been systematically taught that she was worthless to believe, not only that she was worthy of love, but that his love was real and enduring. The first morning of January dawned sharp and clear, the winter light cutting like glass through the frosted windows of his chamber, and Edward stood before the mirror while his valet arranged his finest dark blue superfine coat and the intricate cravat required by fashion, his appearance immaculate as always, even though his hands shook very slightly when he fastened the last of his cufflinks, and wondered, with unfamiliar vulnerability, why his composure deserted him now when it had held in the face of death. He searched his own reflection and interrogated his motives, asking whether he sought to marry Seraphina in order to save her, only to acknowledge that she had already begun to rescue herself the moment she chose to stop swallowing laudanum, and to question the story imposed upon her, and that he had merely removed some of the obstacles placed in her path. He asked whether pity moved him, and dismissed that thought immediately, because what drew him to her was not a fragile helplessness, but the way her laughter seemed to lift the weight from his chest, the way her fierce intelligence met his, and the way her presence made the world feel less frozen. The fear of loving again, after Catherine, still lurked like a shadow at the edge of his mind, a terror of exposing his heart to the risk of shattering loss once more. Yet when he stripped his soul of excuses, he found that, yes, God help him, he was ready to try, and the admission shook him more than any battlefield had ever done. A knock on the door broke his reverie, and Margaret swept in with the casual confidence of a sister who had never believed in waiting for permission, her perceptive gaze sweeping across his face before she asked whether he was prepared. Edward, who would have lied to anyone else on earth, confessed without hesitation that he was terrified, voicing the question that had haunted him through sleepless nights. What if Seraphina refused him? Margaret, who had watched the slow transformation in both of them, replied that if Seraphina declined, he would simply have to respect her choice, but that in her judgment the young woman already loved him, judging by the way she had bloomed under his attention, and the softness in her expression whenever she believed herself unobserved. Edward, still troubled, pointed out that Seraphina had endured 2 years of being told she was mad, damaged, and unworthy, and that he doubted 3 months would be enough to undo so much poison. Yet Margaret answered with calm certainty that if words were not sufficient, he would simply need to devote the rest of his life to proving her value to her, and that Seraphina possessed a strength neither of them had yet fully measured, for they had both survived what should have broken them completely, and together, she believed, they would not merely endure, but thrive. Drawing renewed courage from his sister's unwavering faith in him, Edward reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box containing his grandmother's ring, a simple but elegant gold band set with a clear emerald that echoed the shade of Seraphina's eyes, an heirloom he had never imagined offering to anyone after Catherine's death, until Seraphina had quietly dismantled the tomb he had built around his heart. He had rehearsed his proposal in his mind, composing speeches that were eloquent and proper, yet as he stood in the doorway of the drawing-room and saw Lord Ravenshaw hunched by the window, Lady Agatha rigid on the sofa, and the oppressive air of false civility, he realized that no polished words would suffice, that what he must offer Seraphina could only be expressed in unvarnished truth. When Lady Agatha greeted him with brittle politeness and attempted to steer the conversation toward the long-delayed boundary dispute, Edward cut through her pleasantries with the calm finality of a man who had already decided his course, informing her that he had not come to discuss land or trees, but her stepdaughter. The shift in her expression was instant, the practiced benevolence hardening into something sharp, and she began to declare that Serafina was unavailable, at which point Edward simply announced, in a voice that left no room for misinterpretation, that he wished to marry Lady Serafina. For a breathless moment, the room was utterly silent, the ticking clock seeming to falter, until Agatha recovered enough to protest with horrified incredulity that he could not possibly be serious, insisting that Serafina was unwell, that she was unfit to be a duchess, that the scandal would be ruinous. Edward replied that he had spent 3 months in Serafina's company and found her mind not only sound but remarkable, that he had seen no trace of the madness so conveniently rumored, and when she shifted tactics to urge him to consider his reputation, warning that society would never accept such a match, he told her with a chill finality that he cared nothing for the idle gossip of people who had never lifted a finger to help the woman they condemned. When she hissed that Serafina was damaged, that he would regret his choice within a month, he rose to his full imposing height and informed her that what he found most questionable was not Serafina's state of mind, but the treatment she had endured in this house, then laid a sheaf of papers, his solicitor's initial findings, on the table, and quietly requested that she explain the unmonitored, prolonged administration of laudanum to her stepdaughter and the convenient use of Serafina's inheritance to cover the estate's debts. Lord Ravenshaw's strangled sound of shame and the ashen flush rising in Lady Agatha's cheeks were confirmation enough of guilt, and when she tried to stammer that he could not prove anything, Edward stated in a tone of implacable calm that he could prove enough to destroy her, that he preferred to avoid the ugliness of a public scandal, but would not hesitate to expose every detail of her abuse and financial misconduct to the courts and to society if she refused to consent, leaving her with a very simple choice. She might accept his proposal on Serafina's behalf and leave the future Duchess free to manage her own inheritance, perhaps even bestowing generosity on her father, or she might resist and watch as he tore apart her reputation brick by brick. Cornered and furious, she spat that Serafina would refuse him, that the girl was too damaged to believe anyone could truly want her. Yet Edward only answered that he would accept Serafina's answer from Serafina's own lips and demanded that she be summoned. When Serafina entered the drawing room a few minutes later, wrapped in one of Lady Agatha's dreary grey gowns, confusion and fear flickered across her face as she took in her stepmother's rigid anger, her father's shame, and Edward's grave composure. She asked in a small, bewildered voice what was happening, and Edward moved toward her with a gentleness utterly at odds with the steel he had displayed moments earlier, telling her that there were several truths she needed to hear before he asked any question of consequence. He took her hand, ignoring Agatha's spluttered objection, and told Serafina clearly that she was not mad, that she had never been mad, that what she had suffered was grief weaponized against her by those who found it inconvenient, and that every word spoken to her about her being broken or unworthy had been a lie designed to keep her compliant and her fortune accessible. Tears filled Serafina's eyes as he continued, telling her that she was, in fact, one of the strongest people he had ever known, that she had endured 2 years of isolation and chemical chains, and yet emerged with her compassion and quick mind intact, that she still had the courage to question her reality, to hope, and to stand before him now. When she whispered, almost choking on the words, that she did not understand why he was saying these things, he answered simply that he needed her to believe them because he was about to ask her to marry him. Her shocked gasp and the dizzy sway of her body made it clear that the world had tilted beneath her feet, and Edward hurried to explain that he did not come to her out of pity or a desire to play rescuer, though he would gladly free her from Ravenshaw forever. He came because he wanted to offer her freedom, partnership, and the chance to discover who she might be in a life where no one controlled her thoughts or movements, because he wished to give her his name, his protection, and his heart, not as a burden, but as an equal, and because in the past 3 months she had awakened feelings in him he believed buried with Catherine. Serafina's mind whirled with disbelief and terror and longing, her thoughts racing through all the times hope had been dangled before her only to be snatched away, and she asked in a trembling voice why he would bind himself to a woman everyone believed mad, why he would choose someone so thoroughly marked by sorrow, to which he replied that she was not damaged but wounded, that grief did not make her unworthy, and that she was the only person who had managed to make him feel truly human again after years of living as a walking statue. She admitted that she was afraid that she would disappoint him, fail as a duchess, or collapse under the scrutiny and cruelty of society, and he told her with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch that he too was afraid that only a fool would not be, but that he feared far more the thought of living out his days without her at his side. She looked around the room and saw her father, weeping but nodding his assent, saw Lady Agatha, incandescent with thwarted rage, saw Margaret in the doorway, her cheeks wet with tears of joy, and then she looked back at Edward, at the man who had first seen her when everyone else treated her as invisible, and in that moment she thought of Isabella's last letter, of the promise she had made to live, and of the fragile, stubborn hope that had clung to life inside her, even in the darkest hours. Her voice shook only slightly as she said yes, agreeing to marry him, then repeated her answer, firmer and more personal, when he asked her to call him Edward. What followed took place with the swift inevitability of events long overdue. Edward announced that they would depart Ravenshaw at once and travel to London, that he intended for the wedding to occur within the month, and that he would not leave any span of time in which complications, or Lady Agatha's interference, might arise. That evening, Seraphina packed her entire existence into a single trunk, gathering the few garments, books, and keepsakes allowed to her over 2 lost years, and when she found Isabella's last letter, worn to softness from countless readings, she unfolded it once more and traced the familiar lines that urged her not to let grief consume her, to live fully for them both, to guard the love still in her heart. She slipped the letter into her locket, pressed it against her chest, and whispered to the empty room that she was finally keeping her promise and choosing life. Edward came to her tower one last time, less as a duke, and more as the man who had sacrificed sleep and certainty to stay in this bleak house until he could help her leave it. He asked if he might sit by the window, and they shared a quiet moment looking out at the snow-draped grounds she would no longer be forced to haunt like a ghost. When she asked whether he was truly certain about joining his life with hers, he admitted that certainty had been a stranger to him since Catherine died, and that he had clung only to duty and routine for far too long, but that of this he was absolutely sure, that she had awakened a new, equally precious love in him, not erasing what had come before but adding to it, and that he admired, respected, and cherished her, and was falling more deeply in love with her every day. Her tears came freely then, an outpouring of years of deprivation and disbelief that anyone could speak such words to her, and he wiped them with his thumb, promising that he would repeat the truth of her worth so often that one day she would not merely tolerate it, but believe it. When he finally kissed her, the contact was gentle, reverent, filled with promise rather than urgency, a seal upon the future they were deliberately choosing together, and although she whispered that she was still afraid, she also admitted that she was hopeful, which Edward declared was more than enough, because hope was where all healing began. Outside, snow continued to fall on Ravenshaw, cloaking the estate in silence, but inside the narrow tower room there was, for the first time in years, warmth and the fragile, unmistakable beginning of love. And in the morning, Seraphina would leave that prison and step into the life that awaited her. The world beyond the carriage window seemed almost impossibly vivid to Seraphina, a blur of shifting colors and movement that felt like too much after years of compressed, muted existence. Yet, as she sat opposite Edward with Margaret at her side, rolling steadily toward London, she realized that what unnerved her was not merely the brightness or the noise, but the sheer truth that life had always continued beyond her tower, indifferent to her suffering, and now, at last, inviting her to rejoin it. The morning of their departure from Ravenshaw had arrived with startling speed. She had stood in the echoing entrance hall with her single trunk at her feet, watching footmen carry out the last of Edward's luggage, while her father, gaunt and remorseful, muttered a halting farewell that she acknowledged with a small bow of the head, knowing there were no words that could undo what had been done, and Lady Agatha, unsurprisingly, had chosen not to appear at all. As the carriage finally drew away, wheels crunching over the frozen ground, Edward had half expected Serafina to turn and look back at the imposing house where she had known both childhood and captivity, but she kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead instead, her jaw set in quiet determination, and he understood that there was nothing behind her worth the farewell. The first hours of the journey were overwhelming in ways she had not anticipated. The speed of the carriage left her slightly dizzy after years of moving no faster than her own footsteps. The brightness of snow-laden fields and the clear winter sky stabbed at eyes habituated to dim rooms, and every creak of leather, shout of a passerby, and clang of a distant bell seemed deafening, until Edward noticed the whiteness of her knuckles, where her hands gripped her skirts, and suggested gently that they might stop to rest at the next inn if she wished. She refused, not out of bravado, but from a fierce conviction that she had already slept through too much of her own life, telling him that, after 2 years of numbed existence, she wanted to feel everything, even when it hurt. And Margaret squeezed her hand in approval, assuring her that the onslaught of sensation would settle into familiarity in time. As the day wore on, the rhythm of motion began to soothe rather than agitate, and Serafina found herself pressing closer to the window when they passed through a small village, transfixed by the sight of children hurling snow at one another in raucous play, women gossiping with baskets on their arms, and merchants calling out to customers from open doorways. So much ordinary life, noisy and imperfect and utterly beautiful, that she could not help murmuring that she had almost forgotten the world contained so many people, so much movement, and so many small, unremarkable joys. That night they stopped at a respectable inn, and the prospect of stepping into a crowded public dining room for the first time in years sent fear surging through her like a wave. As they entered the warm, noisy space, she had the unnerving sensation that every gaze swung their way, that everyone somehow knew her story, and she whispered to Edward that they were all staring at her. He replied, in a low voice that steadied her immediately, that the other patrons saw nothing more scandalous than a beautiful woman sharing a meal with her betrothed, while Margaret added that even if a few people did stare, Serafina owed them no explanations or apologies, because their opinion held no authority over her life. They were seated near the fire, and when the innkeeper, eager to impress a duke, sent out roasted chicken fragrant with herbs, fresh bread still warm from the oven, buttered vegetables, and later, apple tart swimming in cream, Serafina took her first bite and stopped, tears spilling down her cheeks almost before she was aware of them, because the rich, layered flavor flooded her senses in a way that startled her, and she confessed in a choked whisper that she had forgotten food could taste like anything at all. Edward, hearing this, felt a fresh wave of quiet fury at the realization that laudanum had dulled not only her emotions but her senses, stealing even the most basic pleasures of being alive, and he reached across the table to clasp her hand with deliberate tenderness, promising that she would never be deprived again. Not of food, not of warmth, not of kindness. By the second day of travel, the relentless shock of new experiences began to ease into a cautious curiosity. Serafina asked questions about London, about Ashford House, about what would be expected of her as a duchess, and Edward answered honestly, explaining that society would be curious and that some people would undoubtedly be cruel because cruelty cost them nothing, but that many would be kinder than she feared. And in any case, anyone who insulted her would also insult him, a risk very few of his peers were foolish enough to take. Margaret, sensing the need for levity, told an embellished story about a pompous lord who had once tried to humiliate Edward during a debate in the Lords, only to be so thoroughly dismantled by the Duke's measured arguments that he had not opened his mouth in public for nearly a month, and Serafina laughed aloud, a bright, unrestrained sound that transformed her whole face, lifting the shadows and revealing the clever, lively woman she was becoming, so that Edward could hardly look away. When they finally reached London at dusk, the city loomed enormous and bustling, a labyrinth of streets and lights and people that seemed a world away from the gray isolation of Ravensshire. The sheer number of carriages and pedestrians, the clang of wheels on cobblestones, the cries of vendors, and the glow of windows made Serafina's nerves tighten once more, and she whispered that there were so many people, wondering aloud how she could possibly exist amid such a throng, but Edward squeezed her hand and reminded her that she did not need to manage the entirety of London in a single breath, only this moment, this day, and then the next. Ashford House, when they arrived, impressed her not merely with its grandeur, the white stone facade, the elegant black railings, the polished brass, but with the unexpected warmth that greeted her inside. The household staff stood assembled in the entrance hall in formal readiness, yet their expressions were open rather than wary, and Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, with kind eyes and a firm, motherly manner, curtsied and welcomed her home, a single word that nearly undid Seraphina, who could not remember the last time any place had felt like it belonged to her. Edward introduced the principal servants, Stevens the dignified butler, Anne the young lady's maid with an easy smile, Mrs. Patterson the round, cheerful cook, and none of them flinched or looked away when they met her gaze. They treated her as their future mistress, not as a creature to be pitied or feared. Mrs. Hartley led her to the rooms prepared for her, and Seraphina paused in the doorway, struck breathless by the light that poured in through tall windows, the softness of the furnishings, and the sense of space after the cramped austerity of her tower. There was a private sitting room with comfortable chairs, a writing desk ready for her use, and shelves of books inviting exploration, and beyond that a bedchamber with a generous four-poster bed dressed in linens of blue and cream, vases of fresh flowers perfuming the air, and small touches everywhere that spoke of thoughtful preparation rather than grudging obligation. Seraphina murmured that it was too much, that she did not deserve such luxury, and Edward answered quietly that she deserved all of it and more, asking only that she try, in time, to accept the kindness without suspicion. Anne helped her bathe in water scented with rose oil, and as Seraphina sank into the warmth, tension she had not even realized she was carrying began to melt from her muscles, and tears slipped down her cheeks again, not from sorrow, but from the sheer, unfamiliar relief of being cared for so gently. The gown laid out for dinner was a soft green silk that echoed the color of her eyes, and when she viewed herself in the mirror afterward, her hair arranged neatly, her skin freshly scrubbed, she saw not the wraith from Ravenshore, but a woman who might, with time, learn to recognize herself again. That evening, they dined quietly in the family dining room. Just Edward, Margaret, and Seraphina, and the conversation was companionable until it inevitably turned toward the engagement ball Edward had planned for 2 weeks hence, an event designed both to announce their betrothal and to reintroduce her to the world she had once inhabited. The notion of facing a crowded ballroom full of people who had heard whispered tales of the mad Ravenshaw girl sent panic flooding through her, and she confessed in an unsteady voice that she did not think she could endure their scrutiny. Edward assured her that he would be by her side throughout the evening, and that his displeasure was something most of society was inclined to avoid, while Margaret added that some people would be cruel purely out of habit, but many would be guided by Edward's open support, and by what they saw with their own eyes, which would be a woman of grace and depth, not the caricature they had been fed. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, each one drawing Seraphina further into her new life. She spent mornings exploring Ashford House, inevitably gravitating toward the vast library that soon became her sanctuary, where she rediscovered poetry and essays and histories she had once devoured, and where, one morning, Edward joined her without ceremony, selecting a book and sitting opposite her so that they read in companionable silence, occasionally sharing a small smile over the pages. This quiet routine, repeated day after day, wove a subtle bond between them that no grand gesture could have matched. Afternoons were devoted to practical transformation as Margaret took her shopping, guiding her through drapers' shops and modistes' salons, urging her to choose colors that pleased her rather than the dreary shades Agatha had imposed. Seraphina found herself drawn to rose pinks, clear sky blues, and deep, dignified burgundies, touching fabrics she had not worn in years, and Margaret told her with playful solemnity that every gown, every ribbon, every pair of embroidered slippers she chose was an act of reclaiming herself from those who had tried to erase her. Evenings often ended in the music room, where Margaret coaxed Seraphina to sit at the pianoforte again, reminding her that fingers which had once danced across the keys could learn the steps anew. At first, her hands stumbled, her memory rusty. Yet as she played simple melodies, closing her eyes against the flood of emotion, both grief and joy rose in her chest. And Edward, listening from a nearby chair, thought that she had indeed been buried alive, and that each note she coaxed from the instrument was another handful of earth thrown off her own coffin lid. On one such evening, after Margaret had retired and the house quieted, Edward promised her that in their marriage he would never treat her as a possession, that she would have autonomy and partnership, that decisions would be made together, and that he wished to be a man worthy of the trust she had already placed in him. She answered softly that she wanted to be worthy of the life he was offering, and he reassured her that worthiness was something she had always possessed, long before he had the privilege of witnessing it. The air between them shifted in that moment, thickening with awareness and the kind of longing that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with mutual desire. Edward moved closer, and with visible struggle for control, asked whether he might kiss her. When she whispered her consent, their lips met in a kiss far deeper and more consuming than the tentative one in the tower, full of promise and banked passion that left them both breathless. When they finally parted, Edward managed to murmur that he should bid her good night. Yet neither of them moved at once, loath to break the fragile, shimmering spell that had settled around them. On the night before the engagement ball, sleep eluded Serafina entirely. She stood at her bedroom window in a simple nightgown, staring out at London's constellation of lights, marveling at how different the vast living city was from the lonely darkness of Ravenshaw, and wondering how she would bear the weight of so many eyes upon her. Margaret, anticipating this, arrived in her dressing gown carrying 2 cups of warm milk sweetened with honey, and they curled up together near the window like sisters, wrapped in blankets against the chill, while Serafina confessed her fear that the following night would expose her to ridicule and confirm every cruel word that had ever been spoken about her. Margaret did not attempt to deny that some people would judge her, but she promised that others would see clearly, especially after Edward made his position unmistakable, and then she shared something that left Serafina speechless, that Edward had confided to her only days earlier that he had not felt so alive since before Catherine's death, and that it was Serafina who had returned color and meaning to his life. Margaret squeezed her hand and reminded her that this was not a one-sided salvation, that Serafina was not merely being rescued but was, in her own way, rescuing him as well, and that the love growing between them was as much a gift she was giving as one she was receiving. After Margaret left, Serafina looked into the mirror and saw not the gaunt, hollow-eyed prisoner she had been at Ravenshaw, but a woman with color in her cheeks and clarity in her gaze, still nervous, still marked by the past, yet undeniably present and alive. She touched Isabella's locket and whispered that she was doing it, that she was truly living, and in the quiet of the room she felt, or chose to believe she felt, a wash of warmth that might be her sister's blessing and her mother's pride. Tomorrow would test her in every way, yet for the first time she trusted that she would not face the ordeal alone, and that knowledge was enough to let her turn toward the bed with something like peace. The ballroom of Ashford House shimmered with the light of 1,000 candles, every crystal and polished surface reflecting them back until it seemed as though the stars themselves had descended to witness London's latest spectacle, which in this case was not a diplomatic triumph or a royal appearance, but the engagement of the city's coldest duke to the young woman society had labeled mad and neatly tucked away. Upstairs in the calm before that storm, Lady Serafina Ravenshaw stood in front of her mirror, while Anne fastened the final tiny buttons of her gown, and although the emerald silk that cloaked her figure was unquestionably exquisite, and the embroidery of leaves and flowers along the neckline and hem transformed her into a living echo of the conservatory she loved, and the diamonds woven into her dark hair caught the candlelight in a way that made her look as though she wore captured starlight, she could barely draw breath past the constriction of fear in her chest. The awareness that an entire ballroom waited below, eager to dissect her every movement, made her vision narrow and her pulse pound, until Anne, hearing the catch in her breathing, called urgently for his grace. Within moments, Edward and Margaret entered, Edward still adjusting his cufflinks, and he crossed the room in 3 strides before dropping gracefully to one knee before Serafina's chair, taking her cold hands in his, and asking her to look only at him. His voice, calm and deliberate, guided her through the simple act of breathing, slow inhalations and exhalations that she matched to the rise and fall of his chest, until the tight, suffocating vice around her lungs began to loosen and she could think again. He told her that they could cancel the ball if she wished, that he would walk away from the entire evening and leave London with her that very night, rather than force her to endure something she did not feel ready to face, and she understood in that moment that this was not an empty courtesy, but a genuine offer. The choice steadied her. She realized that for the first time in years, she truly had one, and after a pause in which she listened to her own heart, she told him that she did not want to run, that she was exhausted by hiding, and by allowing fear to govern every decision. And though she confessed that she was deeply afraid of failing and humiliating him, he answered with fierce conviction that nothing she did could shame him, that she had already survived ordeals far worse than a night of gossip and stares, and that he was proud of her beyond what words could express. He then produced a small velvet case, and when he opened it, Serafina saw her mother's locket, newly polished and repaired, resting on the dark lining. He explained that he had sent trusted servants to Ravenshaw to retrieve the personal belongings that had been denied her, including this cherished piece, and when he opened the locket to reveal the miniatures of her mother and Isabella, Serafina's composure nearly shattered, because it felt as though the two people she had lost were being returned to her in some small way. As he fastened the locket around her throat, he told her that her mother and sister would walk with her tonight, that she would not cross that ballroom alone, and Margaret laid a supportive hand on her shoulder, reminding her that she and Edward would not leave her side. With the cool weight of the locket resting against her skin like a promise and a blessing, Serafina rose, telling herself that she could do this, not because she was suddenly unafraid, but because she refused to let fear dictate the story of her life any longer. Edward reminded her gently that she owed the people below nothing, not perfection, not performance, not penitence, for existing, and that the evening was not about begging their approval, but about claiming her rightful place in a world that had tried to erase her. When they stepped onto the grand staircase, the ballroom spread out below like a glittering sea, every pair of eyes tilting upward as the major domo announced the Duke of Ashford, Lady Margaret Hawke, and Lady Serafina Ravenshaw. A hush fell with almost physical weight, followed by the immediate swell of whispers. People craning their necks to glimpse the infamous mad young woman, some faces avid with curiosity, others sharpened with unkind expectation. Serafina felt her knees threaten to give way, but Edward's arm remained a solid anchor, and he murmured that he had her, that they would descend one step at a time. As they reached the center of the room, Edward raised a hand, and the whispers died at once, for when the Duke of Ashford signaled that he wished to speak, even the most jaded gossip listened. He addressed the room in a clear, resonant voice, acknowledging that many present had heard rumors about Lady Serafina, rumors that painted her as mad and unstable, and declaring that he intended to correct those lies publicly. He told them that she was not mad, and had never been so, that she was a woman who had loved her sister deeply, and had grieved that loss with an honesty that made others uncomfortable, that she had been cruelly mislabeled and isolated for feeling too much rather than too little, and that he, Edward Hawke, chose to stand with her and to honor the truth of who she was, a woman of courage, intelligence, and grace who would soon be his Duchess. His words rippled through the assembled company, shocking some, provoking grudging admiration in others, and drawing visible support from his political allies and old friends who recognized the significance of such a public stand. Turning back to Serafina, he asked, with a gentleness that reached only her even as his words carried to the farthest corners of the ballroom, whether she would dance with him and show them who she truly was. The orchestra struck up a waltz at his signal, and Serafina stepped into his arms, still stiff with the remnants of fear, but gradually relaxing as muscle memory stirred, and she remembered that she had once loved the feeling of moving across a dance floor. At first her steps were hesitant, her body braced for misstep and ridicule. Yet Edward's confident guidance made it difficult to falter, and as they circled the room, the murmur of voices blurred into a distant hum. She realized suddenly that she was no longer dancing for the eyes watching from the edges, That there was only Edward, the music, and the sense of being held safely, while she reclaimed something that had been stolen from her. A genuine smile, small but unmistakable, curved her lips, and Edward's expression softened in response as he whispered that there she was, the woman he had seen in the conservatory and the garden, not the ghost Ravenshaw had tried to create. By the end of the dance, other couples had joined them, the rigid spell broken, and when the final notes faded there was applause. Not the mocking smatter she had feared, but real appreciation. Over the next hour, various guests approached. Some, including an elderly duchess who had known her mother, offered warm words and expressed certainty that her mother would be proud, and a few younger ladies introduced themselves with sincere smiles, clearly more intrigued by her resilience than by the sensational rumors. There were still hostile glances and muttered barbs at the fringes, yet for the first time, Seraphina felt that she was not defined by them, that she existed as more than their cruel narratives. Later, when the crush of bodies and the press of noise became too much, she slipped into a quieter corridor to catch her breath, only to hear the familiar, bitter voice of Lady Agatha emerging from the shadows. Her stepmother stepped forward with venom in her eyes, declaring that nothing had truly changed, that beneath the silken jewels, Seraphina was still the weeping, shattered girl she had been after Isabella's death, that Edward would eventually tire of her, as men always did, especially of women who were damaged, and that when he cast her aside, Agatha would be waiting to reclaim her. For a moment the old panic and doubt rose, claws of memory digging into Seraphina's confidence, but she placed her hand over Isabella's locket and remembered Edward's speech, the kindness of strangers who had greeted her warmly, and the quiet strength she had discovered within herself over the past months. When she looked at Agatha this time, she did not see an invincible tyrant, but a woman made small by her own bitterness, whose power had always depended on convincing others of their worthlessness. In a voice that remained remarkably steady, Seraphina told her stepmother that she was wrong, that she had never been mad, only grieving, that Agatha had manipulated that grief to control her and her inheritance, and that she was done allowing anyone, least of all Agatha, to define her. Agatha sputtered and tried to reassert her authority, but Seraphina cut across her, telling her that she no longer had any power, that those days had ended the moment Seraphina stepped onto the staircase earlier that evening and claimed her place at Edward's side. At that point, Edward himself appeared at the end of the corridor, having stayed close enough to intervene if needed, yet wise enough to let Seraphina confront her tormentor in her own voice, and he announced with glacial politeness that Lady Ravenshaw was no longer welcome in his home, and should leave immediately. Agatha, recognizing defeat when she saw it, looked from Seraphina, now standing tall and unafraid, to Edward's unyielding expression, and left without another word, her retreat as complete as any social ruin. Edward asked Seraphina whether she was all right, and she answered with some surprise that she was, that although her hands still trembled slightly, she also felt lighter than she had in years, as though chains had fallen from her shoulders. They returned to the ballroom, where Margaret greeted them with a beaming smile and drew Seraphina into a circle of young women eager to welcome her, and for the remainder of the night Seraphina talked and laughed and sometimes had to pause to steady her breath, but she remained present, refusing to let fear push her back into invisibility. When the last guest finally departed and she returned to her chamber, she did not collapse in shame or exhaustion, but stood once more at the window in her emerald gown, looking out at the city's lights and whispering to Isabella that she had done it, that she had stood in the light and had not burned. Behind her, Edward watched from the doorway, filled with awe and protectiveness and love, and silently vowed that as long as he lived, no one would ever again succeed in imprisoning or silencing this woman who had fought her way back from the edge. The morning of Seraphina's wedding broke over London with an almost startling clarity, the pale spring sunlight washing the city in a brightness that felt, to her, like a benediction, as if the world itself had chosen to mark the day with unusual grace. As she stood at the window of her bedchamber in Ashford House, watching chimneys smoke and carriages rattle into motion far below, she thought with a kind of stunned wonder that only 6 months earlier she had been certain she would die in that tower at Ravenshaw, slowly fading out of memory, And yet now she was about to walk down an aisle, not as a sacrificial lamb, but as a woman choosing joy and a future of her own volition. Margaret and Anne moved about her with comforting efficiency, their hands skilled and gentle as they helped her into the gown that had been crafted for the occasion. The dress was made of ivory silk that flowed in clean, elegant lines, rather than ostentatious flourishes, the delicate lace overlay adding softness without overwhelming her, and a row of tiny pearl buttons trailed down the back, like a string of captured dew. The train fanned out behind her in a graceful ripple that made every step feel like gliding over still water rather than trudging through the mud of her past. It was not like the glittering confections many society brides chose, yet it suited her perfectly, speaking of quiet strength and understated beauty rather than excess. Margaret placed a wreath of white roses and lily-of-the-valley in Seraphina's dark hair, securing it with carefully placed pins so that it sat like a living crown, and when Anne stepped back and invited her to look, Seraphina turned toward the tall mirror and drew in a slow, tremulous breath. The woman who gazed back at her was undeniably herself, yet changed in ways that went far beyond the expensive fabric or the artful arrangement of hair and flowers. The hollows beneath her cheekbones had softened with proper nourishment. Her skin held the healthy glow of someone who slept through the night without chemical assistance, and her eyes, once dulled by laudanum and despair, now shone clear and bright, filled with nerves, certainly, but also with a steady, hard-won light that spoke of survival and the courage to embrace all that came next. Seraphina knew that the true transformation was not in the gown she wore or the jewels at her throat, but in the way she occupied her own skin. Her posture had changed. She stood with a quiet assurance that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with survival. The world no longer seemed like a battlefield she was doomed to lose, but a landscape she was slowly learning to walk through on her own terms. The sadness that had once drowned her still lived inside her, embedded as deeply as bone, but its crushing weight had lessened. It no longer devoured every breath or overshadowed every thought. It simply existed alongside her joy, part of her story rather than the whole of it. "I wish Mother and Isabella could be here," she whispered, fingers brushing the locket resting against her collarbone, as if the metal itself carried echoes of their laughter. Margaret stepped behind her, meeting Seraphina's eyes in the mirror with a tenderness that steadied rather than smothered. "They are here, Seraphina," she said softly. "They see you, and they are so very proud of the woman you have become." Before Seraphina could answer, a knock sounded at the door, and a footman entered, carrying a letter on a silver tray with the solemnity of a sacred offering. "From Lord Ravenshaw, my lady. Just delivered." Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she broke the seal, braced for whatever words her father had finally chosen. The letter was stiff and inelegant, its phrasing clumsy, yet beneath every line ran a current of stark, painful sincerity. "My dearest Seraphina, I do not deserve your forgiveness. I know this. I failed you as a father in every way that matters. I allowed my wife to imprison you, to drug you, to steal years of your life. I was weak, and my weakness cost you dearly. I hope that someday, perhaps, you might find it in your heart to forgive me, not because I have earned it, but because you deserve to be free of the burden of my failures. I have enclosed your mother's sapphire necklace. She wore it on our wedding day. I thought you might wish to have it today. Be happy, my daughter. You deserve every happiness. Your father." Inside the envelope rested a small velvet pouch, which Seraphina opened with shaking fingers, as though she were unwrapping not a piece of jewelry, but a fragment of another life. Nestled within lay a necklace of deep blue sapphires set in cool silver, elegant and timeless, luminous in a way that seemed to echo her mother's quiet grace. Margaret watched her closely. "What do you wish to do?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady, offering support without pressure. Seraphina weighed the necklace in her palm, feeling not only its physical weight, but the emotional history attached to it. The echoes of a marriage, the failures of a father, the love of a mother. "I forgive him," she said at last, the words emerging slowly but with a calm conviction. "Not because he has earned it, and not because he deserves it, but because I refuse to carry that weight any longer. She fastened the necklace around her throat, the cool metal settling against her skin like a benediction. Something old, something blue, her mind murmured, and she understood that letting go did not equate to forgetting. Her mother and Isabella would forever live within her, woven into her memories and the choices she made, yet she was still allowed, no, entitled, to step forward and claim happiness. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in her eyes. "Am I truly ready for this?" she asked quietly. "To be a duchess, a wife, to face everything that accompanies such a life?" Margaret did not hesitate. "You are ready," she replied firmly, conviction wrapping around Serafina like a cloak. Anne, standing nearby, added in a softer tone, "And you are not facing it alone. You will never be alone again. You have been surviving on your own for years, my lady. Now you get to live, with people who love you." Serafina inhaled slowly, lifted her chin, and met her reflection with a new and deliberate resolve. "Then let us begin," she said. St. George's Chapel in Hanover Square, one of London's most fashionable churches, gleamed with polished stone and colored light as society gathered to witness what many considered the most intriguing wedding of the season. Soaring columns rose toward a beautifully vaulted ceiling, and the stained glass windows scattered jewel-toned light over the assembled crowd. The pews overflowed with members of the ton, Edward's political allies, Margaret's extensive acquaintances, curious onlookers eager to see whether the cold Duke would truly marry the mad Ravenshaw girl. The absence of Lady Agatha was conspicuous and entirely intentional. Edward had made it perfectly clear that she was not welcome. Serafina stood at the entrance of the chapel, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm. Lord Ravenshaw appeared older than she remembered, his face etched with remorse and sleepless nights. "Serafina," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. "I know I have no right to ask this, but may I walk you down the aisle?" She studied him. This man who had failed her when she needed him most, who had looked away while his wife incarcerated her, drugged her, and stole precious years of her youth. She could have refused. No one would have blamed her. Yet after a long moment she said, "Yes, but Father, understand this. This is the last thing I do out of obligation to the past. After today, I build my own future." His eyes filled with tears, gratitude and regret mingling painfully. "I understand," he whispered, "and I am grateful for this mercy." The music swelled as the processional began, and together they walked down the aisle. Serafina felt countless eyes upon her, felt whispers cling to her like invisible threads, but she did not waver. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, on the man waiting at the altar. Edward stood at the front of the chapel, impeccably dressed in formal wedding attire, his dark coat perfectly cut and his cravat flawlessly tied, the very image of a powerful duke. Yet his eyes told a different story, a story of awe, gratitude, and love so profound it almost stole her breath. The cold remoteness that had once defined him was gone. In its place was a man wholly present and deeply devoted. Her heart swelled with a fierce, steady joy. "This is real. This is happening. I am choosing this." When they reached the altar, Lord Ravenshaw placed her hand in Edward's with a soft, broken, "Be happy, daughter," then stepped back, leaving Serafina and Edward standing side by side before God and an entire watching world. The vicar began the familiar liturgy, his voice ringing clearly through the chapel, weaving ancient words and sacred vows into a tapestry of promise. Yet when they reached the moment for personal vows, Edward had requested the right to speak from his heart. He turned to Serafina fully, took both her hands in his, and spoke in a voice steady yet rich with feeling. "Serafina," he said, "I vow to honor you, not as a prize to be displayed or a possession to be controlled, but as my equal in all things. I vow to see you always, to never allow you to vanish into the shadows or forget your worth. I vow to love you through grief and through joy, through darkness and through light, in every season that life brings us. I pledge to be the partner you deserve, the friend you can trust, and the man who will fight for your happiness as fiercely as he once fought only for his own." Her own vows, painstakingly crafted and revised in the quiet hours leading up to this day, rose naturally from her heart. "Edward," she replied, her voice clear though emotion shimmered beneath it, I vow to trust you with my heart, fragile as it has been, broken, mended, and taught to beat again. I vow to stand beside you, no longer hidden or diminished, but as your true partner. I vow to love you with all that I am now, all that I once was, and all that I am yet to become. I vow to remind you, as you remind me, that we are more than our losses and more than our grief. We are the life we choose to create together, one day at a time. They exchanged rings, simple, elegant gold bands, and Edward's hands shook just enough for Seraphina to feel the depth of his feeling as he slid the band onto her finger. Her own fingers trembled as she placed his ring upon his hand, the circle of gold a visible symbol of the vows they had spoken. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the vicar declared. You may kiss your bride. Edward cupped her face with reverent tenderness and kissed her in a way that was both gentle and ardent, a union of respect and passion, sealing the promises they had made. Applause burst through the chapel, not polite and restrained, but warm and genuine. As they turned toward the congregation, Seraphina's gaze swept over the crowd. She saw Margaret, openly weeping happy tears. She recognized friends from the engagement ball, their smiles radiant with sincere delight. Even some of those who had once whispered cruel speculation now looked visibly moved by the undeniable love between the Duke and his new Duchess. Together, Edward and Seraphina walked back down the aisle, not as the distant Duke of Ashford and the disgraced Lady Ravenshaw, but as Edward and Seraphina Hawke, husband and wife, partners in truth, equals in love. Her new title, Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford, felt less like an ornament and more like a promise, a future she had chosen, not one forced upon her. The wedding breakfast at Ashford House reflected this new beginning. Though elegant enough to satisfy the highest standards of society, it pulsed with warmth and laughter rather than rigid formality. Guests toasted them with a mixture of joy and affectionate teasing. Margaret rose first, lifting her glass, tears still glimmering in her eyes. To Seraphina, she said, voice thick with emotion, who taught my brother how to live again, how to love again. And to Edward, who finally showed Seraphina what we have always known, that she has always been worthy of love. Laughter mingled with applause, and another of Edward's longtime friends added, to the Duke who dared defy society in the name of love, and to the lady who proved that society was gloriously, spectacularly wrong about her. The room erupted in good-natured cheering. Later, as the musicians struck up a waltz, Edward extended his hand to Seraphina for their first dance as husband and wife. There was no panic this time, no suffocating dread, only joy, nervous excitement, and an almost serene sense of rightness. How do you feel? He asked quietly as they moved together across the floor. Seraphina looked up at him with a smile that radiated from her very soul. As if I am finally home, she said. Truly, finally home. Throughout the afternoon, she moved among the guests with a grace that was entirely her own. Her intelligence, wit, and quiet strength gradually disarmed even the most skeptical of observers. There were still moments when the press of bodies and the hum of conversation came close to overwhelming her, when her breath hitched and old panic stirred. But she did not flee. She breathed through the fear, remained anchored in the present, and allowed herself to lean, now and then, on Edward's steady presence. She was learning that her scars could exist without ruling her life. As the celebration wound down and preparations began for their departure to Edward's country estate, they slipped away to his study for a brief moment of peace. Seraphina stood at the window, gazing out into the gardens where she had spent so many mornings reading, healing, and rediscovering herself. 6 months ago, she said quietly, I did not believe happiness was meant for me. I truly thought I would live out my days in that tower at Ravenshaw, forgotten, lost in a fog of laudanum and grief. Edward stepped beside her, sliding his arm around her waist, grounding her in the present. And now? He asked. She turned to him, her eyes luminous. Now I am not simply happy, Edward. I am free, free to live, to love, to be myself without shame or fear, free to choose my own path. He drew her closer, resting his forehead against hers. We are both free, he murmured, and we will spend the rest of our lives building a world that honors that freedom." Their kiss deepened then, tender affection melting into the promise of passion and shared nights yet to come. Time passed, and the scene shifted to the serenity of Ashford's country estate. Seraphina sat in the garden, a book open but forgotten in her lap, as the fragrant roses bowed heavy with bloom, and birds sang in the leafy boughs above. Warm sunlight bathed her face, and a gentle breeze tugged playfully at the ribbon of her summer hat. Edward emerged from the house with 2 glasses of lemonade, his coat discarded, and sleeves rolled up in a rare concession to the summer heat. Settling beside her on the stone bench, he handed her a glass and watched her with fond curiosity. "What occupies that clever mind of yours?" he asked. Seraphina considered before answering. "I am thinking that I am happy," she said, "and that I am no longer surprised by that fact." He smiled at that, knowing how monumental such a simple admission truly was. "A remarkable sort of progress," he replied. She hesitated, then continued, "I am also thinking about the letter I received from Father yesterday." Edward's expression tightened slightly, protective instinct flickering in his eyes. "He has left Ravenshaw," Seraphina said. "He has separated from Lady Agatha and moved to Bath. He asked if he might visit us at Christmas." Edward's voice was calm. "And what did you tell him?" She held his gaze. "I said yes, on the condition that it will be only one dinner. He will never be a true father to me. Too much has happened and too many years have vanished into silence. But I can offer him civility." Edward squeezed her hand gently. "You are generous," he murmured. She shook her head. "No, I am healing. There is a difference. Generosity implies I am giving him something he deserves. I am simply choosing not to be chained to bitterness any longer." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that grows only between 2 people who feel entirely safe with each other. After a time, Edward spoke again. "I have been thinking as well," he said. "I wish to establish a charitable foundation for women who have been unjustly declared mad, women without money, protection, or advocates, women who are locked away by relatives who claim to act in their best interests." Seraphina turned to him, eyes shining with sudden emotion. "Edward, that is magnificent." He nodded, his gaze intent. "I hoped you might help me oversee it. Your experience, your understanding of how easily such injustice can occur, your compassion for those in similar cages, you could help us reach women who might otherwise never escape." Emotion swelled in her chest, not the old heaviness of grief, but a powerful sense of purpose. "Turning my pain into something that protects others," she said, her voice thick, "making something good from something so terrible." She straightened with quiet resolve. "Yes, I would very much like that." They sat there for a long while, fingers intertwined, watching the garden sway and rustle in the breeze. A lark took flight from a nearby tree, soaring higher and higher, until it became only a dark speck against the brilliant blue sky. Seraphina watched it and thought of Isabella, laughing as she chased butterflies in a long-ago summer, of her mother reading poetry to her by the fire, of the broken woman she had been in that tower, drugged and convinced that madness was her only truth. "I kept my promise, Bella," she whispered, the words carried away on the warm wind. "I am living, truly living." Edward heard her and understood without any further explanation. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. "I love you," he said simply. Her answering smile was full and radiant, reaching her eyes and transforming her face into something almost luminous. "I love you too," she replied. "And Edward, thank you." He quirked a brow. "For what, my love?" She took a breath. "For demanding that I become your duchess. For refusing to let me remain hidden and forgotten." He shook his head at that, his expression serious but tender. "No, Seraphina, I did not demand. I asked. And you chose." He turned so that she could see the conviction in his eyes. "Never forget that. You chose to trust me. You chose to leave that tower, to face the cruelty of society, to marry me. Most importantly, you chose yourself, your happiness, your future. The courage was, and always will be, yours." She rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him and feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He was right. Every step that had brought her here had required a choice. To trust when trust seemed foolish, to hope when hope was dangerous, to love when love felt terrifying, and to move toward the light even when the shadows felt safer and more familiar. In making those choices, she had not only found a husband and a partner, she had rediscovered herself. The girl she had been before grief shattered her, the woman she was becoming after surviving the unthinkable, a person flawed and scarred but undeniably whole. The sun continued its climb across the sky, the roses nodded on their stems, and the world turned with its usual indifferent beauty. Lady Seraphina Hawke, Duchess of Ashford, once labeled mad, once exiled, once forgotten, now lived freely, joyfully, and authentically. She had been drowning once, sinking steadily while the world looked away, until one man had noticed and refused to let her vanish beneath the surface. He had thrown her a rope, yes, but in the end, she had been the one to seize it, to haul herself back toward the shore, to choose breath over oblivion. That choice had changed everything. And so the story of Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw, now Lady Seraphina Hawke, does not simply end with a title or a marriage, but with a woman reclaimed. She rose from ashes of grief and isolation to claim not only her place in society, but something infinitely more precious, herself. If Seraphina's journey has touched your heart, I invite you to show your support by giving this video a thumbs up. Your likes help this channel reach others who may need stories of healing, courage, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again. Make sure you subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories for more sweeping historical romances that honor resilience, vulnerability, and love that does not erase the past, but transforms it. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale where love dares to reach into the darkest places and bring someone back into the light. I would love to know what stayed with you from Seraphina and Edward's story. Did Edward's declaration at the ball send a shiver down your spine? Were you silently cheering during Seraphina's confrontation with Lady Agatha? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and treasure hearing which moments resonated most deeply with you. If you are craving more Victorian romance, be sure to explore the story linked in the description and in the cards above. Perhaps you will enjoy the tale of a governess who unexpectedly captures a brooding earl's guarded heart, or the story of a bluestocking who dares to match wits with London's most notorious rake. And remember, just like Seraphina, you are not defined by your darkest chapters. You are defined by your courage to step out of them. Until our next story, dear listener, may you move steadily toward your own hard-won happily ever after. This is Lyra, reminding you that love, real, patient, transformative love, is always worth fighting for.